15 minutes before the ruling that would decide whether he lost everything, Isaiah Reeves sat alone at a table he had built with his own hands, in a courtroom paid for by men who had never built anything at all. On the other side of the aisle, 5 lawyers in matching charcoal suits reviewed documents that would strip his name off the door of the company he spent 22 years turning from a one-man garage into something that mattered. Behind them sat Grant Holloway, his former partner, adjusting his cufflinks like a man already rehearsing his victory speech. Isaiah had no lawyer. He had no expert witness. He had a cardboard folder with 14 years of receipts, a legal pad with his own handwriting on it, and a suit that had been pressed by his own iron that morning at 5 a.m., because there was no one left to press it for him. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge reached for her gavel. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman none of the lawyers recognized walked in fast, heels striking the marble floor in a rhythm that didn't ask permission from anyone. She crossed the aisle, set a leather folder down on the empty chair beside Isaiah, and looked at the 5 lawyers across the room the way a person looks at a problem they already know how to solve. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the late entry. I'll be representing Mr. Reeves." Grant Holloway's face went the color of the courtroom walls. Isaiah looked up at her, and for one full second, 22 years fell away, and he was standing in the freezing dark behind his workshop again, looking down at a 9-year-old girl who had nowhere left to go. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back. Not 15 minutes. 15 years. Isaiah Reeves was 37 years old the winter everything changed, and by then he had already learned that life did not owe him an explanation for anything it took from him. He'd lost his wife, Denise, 4 years earlier. A car accident on a rain-slick overpass outside of Charlotte. The kind of accident that takes 11 seconds and rewrites the rest of a person's life. Their son, Micah, had been 3 years old at the time, old enough to remember his mother's voice if he tried hard enough, too young to understand why she stopped coming home. Isaiah didn't remarry. He didn't date. He worked. He ran a small woodworking shop on the edge of Millbrook, North Carolina, a converted garage with a hand-painted sign that read Reeves Fine Woodwork. The paint already chipping at the corners because Isaiah had painted it himself the week he opened and never gotten around to redoing it. Inside, the shop smelled like sawdust and linseed oil and the particular kind of quiet that exists in a place where a man works with his hands instead of his mouth. He built what people needed. Kitchen tables, bookshelves, a crib once, for a young couple 2 streets over who couldn't afford the ones at the furniture store in town. He built it for cost, materials only, because the baby was coming whether or not the parents had the money, and Isaiah had never been able to look at a need he could fill and walk past it. His morning started at 5. Coffee, black, in a chipped mug that had belonged to his own father. Breakfast for Micah, who was 7 that winter. All elbows and questions. The kind of kid who wanted to know why wood had rings and why some trees lived 300 years and some didn't make it to 30. Isaiah answered every question he could and told the truth about the ones he couldn't. He walked Micah to school himself most mornings, even when the shop needed him at 7 sharp, because he had promised himself a long time ago that his son would never wonder if he mattered more than the work. Money was tight in the way it is tight for a man who refuses to cut corners on quality, to save on cost. Some months he made rent with $11 to spare. He never told Micah that. He told him instead that some months were lean, and lean months meant grilled cheese for dinner instead of the diner, and grilled cheese, cooked right, was better anyway. That was the life. Small, steady, honest. A life built one plank at a time by a man who had decided that if the world was not going to hand him anything, he would simply make what he needed with his own 2 hands. He had no way of knowing that on a Tuesday night in December, with the temperature dropping into the 20s and frost already forming on the shop's single window, his life was about to change in a way no amount of planning could have prepared him for. He was closing up, 8:30, later than usual, because a client's dining table needed one more coat of finish before the cold set in and slowed the drying. He was locking the side door when he heard it, a sound so small, he almost mistook it for the wind. A cough. Human. Close. He turned his flashlight toward the alley behind the shop, the narrow strip of gravel between his building and the old feed store next door, and found a girl pressed into the corner where the two walls met, knees pulled to her chest, a threadbare jacket wrapped around her that was doing almost nothing against the cold. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old. Isaiah did not move fast. He had learned, somewhere in his life, that people who are frightened do not need someone moving fast at them. He crouched down slowly, keeping the flashlight low so it wouldn't blind her. "Hey," he said, "you're going to freeze out here." The girl said nothing. Her eyes tracked him with the wary stillness of someone who had learned that adults were not always safe, that kindness sometimes came with a price attached, and that the safest thing to do was wait and watch and say as little as possible. "You got somewhere to be tonight?" Isaiah asked. A long pause. Then, barely audible, "No, sir." "You got somebody looking for you? Family? Anybody?" Another pause, longer this time. Something moved behind her eyes. Something that looked like a decision being made about how much truth was safe to give. "No, sir." Isaiah looked at her jacket, at the thin sneakers with a hole worn to the left toe, at the way her hands had gone to color the frost on his window. He thought about Micah, warm in their small house 4 blocks away, probably already asleep with the hallway light on, because he still didn't love the dark. He thought about what his own father used to say, a man who'd worked 40 years on a factory floor and never once had much, but never once turned away a person who needed a meal at his table either. You don't have to have a lot to give a little. You just have to decide the little matters. "My name's Isaiah," he said. "I've got a shop right here, and a house not far from it, and a boy about your age who's probably eating cereal for dinner, because I forgot to buy anything else. You're welcome to come warm up. That's all I'm offering tonight. Just warm." The girl studied him for a long moment. Then she said the words that Isaiah Reeves would carry with him for the rest of his life. Words so simple and so devastating that he had to look away from her for a second to keep his composure. "I won't be any trouble," she said. "I don't eat much." Isaiah felt something crack open in his chest, something that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with recognition. He knew what it was to make yourself small. So the world would have less reason to push you out. "You let me worry about that," he said. "What's your name?" "Amara," she said. Then, after a beat quieter, "Amara Bennett." He didn't call the police that night, though he told her plainly that he would need to, that a child sleeping in an alley in December was not something he could pretend he hadn't seen. What he did first was walk the 4 blocks to his house, sit her down at the kitchen table across from a very confused but instantly delighted Micah, and put a bowl of the good soup in front of her, not the instant kind. She ate like someone who had learned not to trust that there would be a second helping. Isaiah gave her one anyway. The county came the next morning, as he'd known they would. A caseworker named Diane Okafor with tired eyes and a stack of files thicker than any one person should have to carry. Amara had been in the system 11 months. 2 placements. Both ended for reasons a file described in language too clinical to mean anything and too careful to say the truth outright. She had run from the second one 3 weeks earlier and had been surviving on her own since, in doorways and behind buildings, in a town that had over 4,000 people in it, and had somehow managed not to notice a 9-year-old girl disappearing into its cracks. "She's a hard placement," Diane told Isaiah quietly, out on the porch, while Amara sat inside pretending not to listen. "Runs. Doesn't talk much. Most families give her back inside of a month." "Why?" Isaiah asked. Diane hesitated. "She doesn't ask for anything. People mistake that for not needing anything. And when she does need something and nobody notices, she leaves before they can tell her no." Isaiah looked back to the window at the small girl sitting very still at his kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, the way you fold your hands when you've learned that fidgeting draws attention, and attention is not always safe. "I'm not asking for a placement," he told Diane. "I'm asking what I need to do to make sure that girl never sleeps outside again." Diane looked at him for a long moment. The particular look of a caseworker who has seen 1,000 adults say the right words and mean about half of them, trying to figure out which kind of man was standing on this porch. "You're a single father already," she said. One income. A business that, from what I understand, isn't exactly Fortune 500. No, Isaiah agreed. It isn't. This wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing has been easy for me yet, Isaiah said. I don't imagine that changes now. It took 4 months of paperwork, home visits, and a hearing in front of a family court judge who asked Isaiah exactly one question that mattered. Why do you want this? To which Isaiah answered without rehearsing it. Because somebody should want her a long time before I did, and I don't intend to be one more person who almost did. The judge granted the placement. 2 years later, it became permanent. Amara Bennett became Amara Reeves, and the small house 4 blocks from the woodworking shop went from holding 2 people to holding 3, and something in it that had been quiet since Denise died began slowly to make noise again. The early months were not easy. Diane had been right about that. Amara did not trust good things. She hoarded food in her room for the first 3 weeks. Small crackers and apple slices tucked under her pillow, evidence that a part of her still believed this would end the way the others had. Isaiah found the stash one afternoon while changing her sheets and said nothing about it directly. He simply started leaving a small bowl of fruit on her nightstand every night, refilled without comment, until one day she didn't need to hide any anymore, because some part of her finally understood that the food wasn't going anywhere and neither was he. She flinched at Ray's voices, even Micah's ordinary 7-year-old shouting during backyard games, and it took Isaiah explaining, gently and more than once, that loud in this house meant excited, not dangerous, before she stopped bracing every time someone laughed too hard. She was fiercely, unusually smart, and for a long time she hid the way she hid everything else, giving vague answers in school, turning in work that was careful never to stand out. It was Micah who noticed first, the way children notice things adults overlook because they're too busy looking for the complicated explanation. She does my math homework in her head, Micah told Isaiah one evening, scandalized and delighted in equal measure, before I even write the numbers down. Isaiah watched Amara more closely after that, and he saw it too. The quick calculations she did without meaning to, the way she read faster than any 9-year-old he'd ever met, the questions she asked about how things worked that went 3 layers deeper than most kids bother to go. He asked her about it directly one night at the kitchen table, over the dinner dishes. You're smart, Amara, real smart. Why do you make yourself seem like you're not? She was quiet for a long moment, turning a fork over in her hands. Smart makes people notice you, she finally said. Noticing isn't always good. Isaiah felt that same crack open in his chest that he'd felt in the alley. He set down the dish towel and sat across from her. In this house, he said, smart is safe. You hear me? You can be as smart as you want at this table, and nobody's going anywhere because of it. She looked at him for a long moment, the same careful, assessing look she'd given him the night they met, weighing whether the words were true. Okay, she said quietly. It took years before she fully believed it, but that night was the first brick in the foundation. He raised them the same, and he raised them differently, because that was what fairness actually required, not identical treatment, but attention paid to what each child actually needed. Micah needed encouragement to slow down and think before he acted. Amara needed encouragement to trust that acting was allowed at all, that she didn't have to earn permission to want things out loud. Isaiah taught them both the same lessons in the shop on Saturday mornings, sawdust in their hair, the radio playing something old and worn out from the cassette deck he refused to replace. Measure twice. Cut once. Don't force the wood. If it's fighting you, you're doing something wrong, not the wood. And the one he said so often it became something close to scripture in that house. Keep every receipt. Paper doesn't lie, even when people do. He didn't know yet how much that last lesson would matter. 15 years later, in a courtroom he hadn't imagined existed, money stayed tight. Tighter, if anything, with a third mouth to feed and a third set of school supplies to buy every August. Isaiah picked up side work where he could find it, repairing porches, building fences, anything with a paycheck attached. He sold his father's old truck the year Amara turned 11, Not because he needed to, but because the transmission repair on the shop's delivery van cost more than he had, and the business needed the van more than he needed sentiment. He never told the kids why the truck disappeared from the driveway. He just told them the shop needed it more. There were harder moments, too, the kind that had nothing to do with money. The year Amara turned 12, a woman at the grocery store watched Isaiah pay for a cart full of groceries for 3, watched Amara, lighter-skinned, with her mother's features from a family Isaiah had never met and never would, standing beside him, and asked, loud enough for half the checkout line to hear, "Is that your daughter, or are you babysitting?" Isaiah felt Amara go rigid beside him. He felt his own jaw tighten, and he answered the way he answered most things that tried to provoke him, with a steadiness that cost him more than the woman would ever know. "She's my daughter," he said, same as if she came from my own body. That answered your question. The woman didn't say anything else. Amara didn't say anything either, not until they were back in the car, when she finally asked, in a small voice, "Does that happen to you a lot? Because of me?" Isaiah turned in the driver's seat and looked at her directly. "It happens because some people can't imagine a family that doesn't look like what they expect," he said. "That's their limitation. Amara, not yours, not mine. You hear me?" She nodded, but he could see it sat with her, the same way every slight sat with child who had already learned, before she ever met him, that the world sometimes decided who belonged and who didn't afford bother to ask any questions. Isaiah made a decision that day, quiet and permanent, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure his children never had to wonder whether they belonged in it. The business grew slowly, the way honest things grow. By the time Amara was 14, Reeves Fine Woodwork had outgrown the converted garage and moved into an actual workshop with 3 employees and a small showroom out front. Isaiah still built every custom piece himself, still refused to cut a corner even when a client wouldn't have noticed, and word of that kind of stubborn integrity traveled slowly but traveled far in a town like Millbrook. It was around then that Grant Holloway first walked through the door. Holloway was a local businessman mid-40s, sharp-suited even in a town where most people dressed for the weather instead of the mirror. He had money from a chain of hardware stores his family had built 2 counties over, and an eye, he said, for undervalued opportunity. "You've got something real here," Holloway told Isaiah, running a hand along a walnut credenza in the showroom. "Craftsmanship people don't make anymore, but you're thinking too small. You could be supplying furniture to half the state if you had the capital and the operations to scale it." Isaiah was cautious by nature, the caution of a man who had built everything. He had $1 at a time and understood exactly how much each dollar had cost him. But Holloway was patient and persuasive, and he showed up more than once with real numbers, real plans, and, for the first 2 years at least, real results. Under Holloway's investment and business sense, Reeves Fine Woodwork became Reeves Manufacturing Company, with a proper facility on the industrial side of town and 40 employees on the payroll, and contract with furniture retailers across 3 states. Isaiah gave Holloway 40% ownership in exchange for the capital and the operational expertise. It felt at the time like the kind of trade a smart man made. He kept 60%, kept the CEO title, kept his name on the building. He told himself that was enough control to protect what mattered. He would spend years afterward wondering exactly when that trust had started rotting from the inside and never quite landing on a single moment. That was the nature of the thing. It never announced itself. Amara left for college on a full academic scholarship the fall she turned 18. The kind of scholarship that existed because a guidance counselor named Mrs. Whitfield had spent 2 years quietly pushing Amara's applications in front of the right people, convinced correctly that the girl in front of her was the kind of mind universities build entire departments hoping to attract. The morning she left, Isaiah drove her the 3 hours to campus himself, her belongings fitting into the trunk of his car with room to spare, because neither of them had ever been the kind of people who accumulated more than they needed. At the dorm, unloading the last box, Amara turned to him with an expression he hadn't seen on her since she was 9 years old, and deciding how much of the truth was safe to give a stranger. "I want to be a lawyer," she said. I've wanted it since I was 15. I never told you because I thought you'd think it was too big. Isaiah set the box down slowly. Why would I think that? Because it costs a lot. Because people like me don't usually. She stopped herself, corrected. Because I didn't want you to feel like you had to make it happen if it was too much. Isaiah looked at his daughter, this brilliant, careful, still learning to want things out loud young woman, and felt something in his chest swell so large it nearly hurt. Amara, he said, I have never once in 9 years thought anything you wanted was too big. I think the world been telling you that your whole life, and I think it's wrong every single time. You want to be a lawyer. You're going to be the best one this state has ever seen. And whatever it costs, we'll figure out. That's not a promise I'm making lightly. That's a fact. She hugged him then, hard and sudden. The kind of hug that carried 9 years of unspoken things in it. I won't let you down, she said. You never have, Isaiah told her. Not once. He drove home alone that evening with the radio off. The empty passenger seat beside him louder than any music could have been, and allowed himself, for the length of that drive, to be proud in a way he rarely let himself feel out loud. He didn't know it then, but that pride would be the thing that carried him through the 7 hardest years of his life. The years when the company he'd built with his own 2 hands would nearly be taken from him by the man he'd trusted to help him grow it. The unraveling started small, the way these things always do. It was a Thursday in March, 4 years after Mar left for college, when Isaiah collapsed at the shop. He'd been feeling off for weeks, headaches, a heaviness in his left arm he chalked up to overwork, a fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to fix. He told himself it was age catching up to him, told himself he'd see a doctor once the Hendricks order shipped. He was 51 years old and had never once, in his adult life, put his own health ahead of a deadline. The collapse happened in the middle of the shop floor, in front of 6 employees, and the diagnosis that followed, a minor stroke, caught early, recoverable but serious, put him in the hospital for 8 days and out of the shop for 6 weeks. Grant Holloway visited every day of those 8 days, brought flowers, brought coffee for the nurses, sat by Isaiah's bed with a concerned expression of a business partner who genuinely cared. Isaiah believed every second of it, because he had no reason yet not to. On day 6, with Isaiah still groggy from medication, still fighting a headache that made reading anything longer than a sentence feel impossible, Holloway brought in a folder. I know this is bad timing, Holloway said, but the Meridian contract renewal needs a signature by Friday or we lose the whole account. I've had legal draw it up exactly like last year's terms. I just need your John Hancock, so we don't lose $400,000 in revenue while you're recovering. Isaiah, exhausted, trusting, his vision still swimming at the edges from the medication, signed where Holloway pointed. He would not learn for another 3 years exactly what he had signed that day. It was not a contract renewal. It was a restructuring of the company's ownership shares, buried in language dense enough that even a sharp mind reading it slowly and carefully might have missed a mechanism, a dilution clause tied to a new round of operational capital that Holloway would inject through a shell entity called Meridian Capital Partners, an entity Holloway himself controlled, quietly through a chain of paperwork that took real forensic effort to untangle. Over the following 3 years, Meridian Capital Partners invested in Reeves Manufacturing 4 separate times, each investment diluting Isaiah's ownership stake a little further, each time presented to him as necessary for growth, for stability, for weathering some crisis Holloway described in numbers Isaiah, still recovering, still trusting, no longer had the bandwidth to fully interrogate the way he once would have. By the time Isaiah's health had fully returned, his ownership stake in the company that bore his name had fallen from 60% to 22%. He didn't know it yet. Holloway had made sure of that. There was a man named Otis Fry who worked as the company's bookkeeper, a quiet, careful 60-year-old who had been with Isaiah since the garage days, who noticed things nobody else on the floor thought to notice. It was Otis who first came to Isaiah 18 months before the lawsuit, with a concern he could not quite prove. The numbers don't add up clean, Otis told him one evening after everyone else had gone home, spreading printouts across Isaiah's desk. Not in a way I can point to one line and say that's wrong. But money's moving through Meridian that doesn't match up with what Meridian's supposed to be doing for us. And your ownership percentage keeps shrinking every time we do one of these capital rounds. And I don't understand why the rounds keep happening when the shop's been profitable every quarter for 2 years running. Isaiah looked at the numbers, and something cold moved through his chest. The first real crack in the trust he'd built with Holloway over 8 years. "You think Grant's stealing from me," he said. "I think," Otis said carefully, "that I can't prove anything yet, and a man like Holloway doesn't leave loose threads for people like me to pull on without a real fight. But I think you should start keeping copies of everything that crosses your desk. Every signature, every document, before you sign it and after." Isaiah did. It was the one thing Holloway hadn't counted on, because it was the one lesson Isaiah had built his entire life around, long before Grant Holloway ever walked through his door. Keep every receipt. Paper doesn't lie, even when people do. For 18 months, Isaiah quietly copied every document Holloway put in front of him before he signed it, filed them in a locked drawer home, said nothing to anyone, watched and waited, the way a careful man watches a wound to see whether it's healing or getting worse. It was getting worse. He just didn't yet have enough to prove exactly how. The lawsuit came on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a process server to the front desk of Reeves Manufacturing, while Isaiah was on the shop floor inspecting a batch of finished cabinetry. He read the paper standing in the parking lot, because he couldn't make himself sit down for it. Meridian Capital Partners, now holding a controlling 53% stake in the company through its accumulated investment rounds, was filing to remove Isaiah Reeves as CEO on grounds of gross financial mismanagement, citing a pattern of unauthorized expenditures and declining operational efficiency that Isaiah had never once seen reflected in the numbers he'd built his life around. The lawsuit also sought an emergency injunction to freeze Isaiah's remaining shares pending a forced sale of company assets to a furniture conglomerate out of Charlotte, a sale that, buried in the paperwork, listed Grant Holloway's shell entity as receiving a consulting facilitation fee worth more than Isaiah's entire remaining stake. Isaiah understood, standing in that parking lot with the October wind cutting through his work jacket, exactly what had happened. Holloway hadn't just diluted his ownership. He'd engineered, patiently, over years, the exact conditions required to take the whole company, dress the theft up as a shareholder vote, and walk away richer than he'd been the day he first admired that walnut credenza in Isaiah's showroom. The board meeting 3 days later was a formality dressed up as due process. Holloway sat at the head of the table Isaiah himself had built, flanked by 2 Meridian representatives Isaiah had never met before that morning, and explained in the calm, reasonable voice of a man who had rehearsed every word that the board had lost confidence in Isaiah's leadership. "This isn't personal, Isaiah," Holloway said. "The company's outgrown what one man can run alone. You built something real here. I'm not taking that away from you. I'm just making sure it survives the transition into what it needs to become." Isaiah looked at the man across the table, a man he'd trusted at his hospital bedside, a man who had eaten dinner at his kitchen table more times than he could count, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. "You forged my signature on documents I never agreed to," Isaiah said quietly. "You used me lying half-conscious in a hospital bed to steal 38% of the company I built with my own 2 hands. Don't you dare sit there and call that a transition. Prove it," Holloway said, and for the first time in 8 years, Isaiah heard something underneath the smoothness of his voice. Not guilt, but the flat confidence of a man who had made very sure there was nothing left to prove. He had a lawyer for exactly 6 weeks after that, a local attorney named Pete Sorensen, who took the case on a payment plan Isaiah could barely afford, and who told him honestly, after reviewing the paperwork, that Meridian's legal team was going to bury them in motions and depositions until Isaiah either ran out of money or ran out of time. Whichever came first. Money ran out first. Pete withdrew from the case 4 days before the emergency hearing. Not because he wanted to, he said, but because he had a family to feed, and Isaiah couldn't pay him another $1, and there was no shame in that, Pete told him, Just a plain arithmetic of a fight between a man and a corporation with a legal budget the size of a small country's. Isaiah told no one at first. Not Micah, who was 24 by then, working construction 2 towns over, still close enough to visit most weekends. Not Amara, who was in her 3rd year at a corporate law firm in Atlanta, building a reputation as one of the sharpest young litigators in the state, working cases far bigger and far away from the small furniture company in Millbrook that had raised her. He told no one because some part of him, the same part that had never once in his life put his own needs first, could not stand the thought of either of his children seeing him lose. It was Otis Fry, in the end, who told Micah, quietly over coffee, 3 weeks before the hearing. "Your daddy's about to lose everything," Otis said, "and he's too proud to tell either one of you, and I think that's a mistake, and I think you should know." Micah called Amara that same night. She was in the middle of trial prep on a case worth more money than she'd ever handled in her career, exhausted, running on 4 hours of sleep and hotel coffee, when her phone rang at 11:30 with her brother's name on the screen. "Micah, I've got a filing due at—" "Dad's about to lose the shop," Micah said, and the words came out of him fast and raw, the way words come out when a person has been holding them too long. Some man he trusted stole most of the company from him while he was in the hospital after his stroke, and now they're trying to force him out completely. And he's had no lawyer for weeks because he can't pay one. And he didn't tell either one of us because you know how he is. Amara, you know exactly how he is. Amara sat very still on the edge of her hotel bed, the trial prep documents forgotten on the desk behind her. "When's the hearing?" 9 days, Micah said. 9 days, and it's the whole thing, not just a hearing. The judge is deciding whether to finalize the whole sale. Amara closed her eyes. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in an alley behind a woodworking shop, about a man crouching down slowly so as not to frighten her, about soup that wasn't instant, and a bowl of fruit that never ran out, and a voice that told her, more times than she could count, that Smart was safe in that house, and she never had to make herself small again. "I'm coming home," she said. "Tonight." "Amara, you've got a trial." "I've got a father," she said. "The trial can wait." "He can't." She called her managing partner at 1 a.m, explained the situation in 4 sentences, and requested emergency personal leave. She was told, in careful corporate language, that walking away from a case this significant this close to trial could have consequences for her standing at the firm. "I understand," Amara said, "and I'm still going." She was on the road by 2 a.m., driving through the dark with nothing but coffee and the specific, focused clarity of a person who has finally found the one thing worth risking everything for. She arrived at Isaiah's house at 6:30 in the morning, letting herself in with the keys she'd kept for 15 years, and found her father at the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she'd first eaten real soup as a frightened 9-year-old, staring at a stack of legal papers with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of ideas. He looked up when she walked in, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You didn't tell me," Amara said quietly. "I didn't want you to see me like this," Isaiah said. Amara pulled out the chair across from him, the same chair she'd sat in the night they met, and reached across the table to take his hand. "Dad," she said, "you crouched down in a freezing alley 15 years ago and told a scared little girl she'd never sleep outside again. You've spent every day since then making sure I never once wondered if I mattered." Her voice caught just slightly before she steadied it. "You don't get to hide the one time you needed someone to show up for you. Not from me. Not ever." Isaiah felt something break open in his chest. The same crack he'd felt 15 years ago. Except this time it wasn't sorrow filling the space. It was something closer to hope. "I don't have a lawyer anymore. Amara, I can't afford." "You have one now," she said. "Show me everything." For the next 7 days, Amara Reeves did not sleep more than 3 hours a night. She sat up at the same kitchen table, papers spread across every surface, and worked through 14 years of the careful, meticulous records her father had kept. Every receipt, every invoice, every copied document from the locked drawer, exactly the way he'd taught her, exactly the way he'd taught himself, long before either of them had any idea how much it would someday matter. Otis Fry came by every evening after the shop closed to walk her through financials, patient and precise, filling in the numbers with the specific knowledge of a man who had watched something wrong happen for years and never had the proof to stop it. Together, they began to see the shape of it, the shell entity, the pattern of capital rounds that always seemed to coincide with moments when Isaiah was too distracted or too trusting to look closely, the consulting fee buried in the sale documents that traced back through 3 layers of paperwork, directly to Grant Holloway's own accounts. On the 4th night, Amara found it. The document Holloway had put in front of Isaiah in the hospital, the one he called a contract renewal, compared side by side against the copy Isaiah had made of it before signing. Exactly the way Otis had told him to. Exactly the way Isaiah had taught his children to keep every piece of paper that ever crossed their hands. The signature on the version filed with the county recorder's office did not match the signature on Isaiah's copy. Not in the way a natural signature varies day to day. In the way a signature looks when it has been traced carefully by someone who had studied the original closely enough to fool a courtroom that wasn't looking hard enough. Amara sat back on the table at 2 a.m, her heart pounding, and looked at her father, who had fallen asleep in the armchair across the room, exhausted from a week of hoping in a way he hadn't let himself hope in years. "Got you," she whispered, to no one, to Holloway, to the entire architecture quiet theft that had nearly taken everything her father built. "I've got you now." She spent the 5th and 6th days on the phone, calling in every favor she had earned in 3 years of relentless, careful work. A forensic document examiner in Raleigh who owed her from a case 2 years earlier and agreed to review the signatures on an emergency basis. A forensic accountant who could trace the shell entity's ownership back to Holloway within 48 hours. And a retired judge she clerked for during law school who, upon hearing the full story, made exactly one phone call that ensured the emergency hearing would be presided over by a judge who took financial fraud claims seriously and did not rush toward a corporation's version of events simply because the corporation had better suits. On the 7th night, with the hearing 2 days away, Amara sat across from her father one more time at the kitchen table, the same 2 chairs, 15 years later. "I need you to understand something before we walk in there," she told him. "This isn't going to look like the man you knew. Grant Holloway is going to sit in that courtroom and act like the reasonable one. And I am going to have to be sharper and colder than you've ever seen me be. And it's going to feel strange watching me do it. But I need you to trust me the exact same way you trusted a 9-year-old girl in an alley 15 years ago. Completely. And without needing to understand every piece of it first." Isaiah looked at his daughter, a grown woman now, brilliant and fierce and utterly unrecognizable from the girl who once had crackers under her pillow because she didn't believe good things lasted, and felt a pride so enormous it nearly stole his voice. "Amara," he said, "I have trusted you since the night you told me you wouldn't be any trouble. I have never once had reason to stop." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and for a moment neither of them needed to say anything else. The emergency hearing convened at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning in the Cedar County Superior Courthouse, a building with tall windows and worn wooden floors that had absorbed 60 years of the county's disputes. Grant Holloway arrived with 5 lawyers from a firm in Charlotte, the kind of firm that billed more per hour than Isaiah's shop had made in some of its leanest months. He wore a navy suit tailored close enough to look effortless. And he did not look at Isaiah once as he took his seat, the posture of a man who had already mentally moved on to the celebration afterward. Isaiah sat alone at the defendant's table for the first 15 minutes. Exactly as we found him at the very beginning of this story, a folder of receipts in front of him, a legal pad with his own careful notes, and no lawyer beside him, because Amara had been in the judge's chambers. She had requested, through proper channels, an emergency pre-hearing conference to present newly discovered evidence of fraud, evidence significant enough that the Judge Renata Alvarez, a woman with 18 years on the bench and a well-earned reputation for having no patience whatsoever for corporate parties who assumed the smaller side in the room would simply fold, had granted the request without hesitation. When Amara walked to the courtroom doors at 9:45, folder in hand, and crossed the aisle to sit beside her father, she did not yet announce who she was to him. Not to the room. Not even, in that first moment. Fully to Isaiah, who was still catching up to the fact that his daughter, the little girl he had raised at that kitchen table, was about to stand in front of a judge and fight for everything he had. "Your Honor, I apologize for the late entry," Amara said, standing, her voice steady in a way that carried to every corner of the room without needing to be raised. "I'll be representing Mr. Reeves." Amara Reeves of counsel. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Grant Holloway's head turned sharply. His lead attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent. Two of the Meridian representatives exchanged a look that had, for the first time all morning, something like uncertainty in it. "Reeves," Holloway said, half under his breath, loud enough for the room to catch it anyway. "You're his daughter," Amara said, turning to face him directly for the first time. "Yes, I imagine that complicates your morning considerably." Judge Alvarez rapped her gavel once, more out of habit than necessity, because the room had already gone quiet on its own. "Counsel, before we proceed to the merits of the injunction, you indicated in chambers that you have newly discovered evidence bearing directly on the authenticity of the documents underlying this dispute. I'll hear it now." Amara opened her folder. For the next 40 minutes, she took the courtroom through exactly what 14 years of her father's meticulous record-keeping had made possible. She presented the copy of the hospital bed document Isaiah had made before signing, side by side with the version Holloway's team had filed with the county recorder. She called the forensic document examiner from Raleigh, who testified under oath that the signature on the recorded version showed clear indicators of tracing rather than natural signing. Inconsistent pen pressure, unnatural pauses in stroke continuity, characteristics that, in a professional opinion, were not consistent with a signature produced through normal hand motion. She called the forensic accountant, who walked the court through the ownership chain of Meridian Capital Partners, layer by layer, until the final page of the presentation showed, in plain and undeniable terms, that the entity Grant Holloway had used to slowly dilute Isaiah's ownership over 3 years was controlled quietly and entirely by Grant Holloway himself. "What you are looking at, Your Honor," Amara said, "is not a business dispute. It is not a disagreement about management style or operational efficiency. It is a documented pattern of fraud committed against a man recovering from a medical emergency, executed with enough patience and enough legal sophistication to survive 8 years of quiet trust, because the person committing it understood something true about my client. That Isaiah Reeves is not the kind of man who assumes the worst of people. That he builds, that he trusts what he builds. Mr. Holloway didn't just steal a company. He weaponized my father's integrity against him." Grant Holloway's lead attorney rose, tried to object on grounds of relevance, tried to characterize the signature discrepancy as an administrative inconsistency rather than fraud. Judge Alvarez, who had spent 18 years learning exactly how to tell the difference between a real objection and a stalling tactic, overruled him without much patience left in her voice. "Counsel," she said, "I have a sworn forensic document examination and a traced ownership chain that leads directly back to your client's personal accounts. I am not inclined to call that an administrative inconsistency. Sit down." Holloway himself was called to the stand near the end of the hearing, and it was there, under direct examination, that the room finally saw the man beneath 8 years of careful charm. "You didn't steal anything," Holloway said, his voice rising for the first time all morning, the practiced smoothness finally cracking. "I built the systems that turned that garage into a real company. I brought the capital. I brought the contracts. Isaiah built furniture. I built a business. You cannot seriously stand there and tell me the growth wasn't mine to claim a share of." "You had 40% fairly earned, Mr. Holloway," Amara said, her voice never rising to match his. "You were not satisfied with 40% that you earned. You engineered a path to 53% that you stole, using a man's hospital bed as your opportunity. There is a difference between building value and taking what was never offered. I think somewhere underneath all of this, you know that difference perfectly well. Holloway had no answer for that. The room watched him search for one, and come up with nothing but silence. Judge Alvarez did not take long to rule. She found, based on the evidence presented, that the disputed capital rounds executed to Meridian Capital Partners were procured through documented fraud, that the signature on the foundational document was not authentic, and that the entire chain of ownership dilution stemming from it was therefore void. She restored Isaiah Reeves' ownership stake to its original 60%, removed Grant Holloway from any operational or governance role in Reeves Manufacturing Company effective immediately, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal review, given what she described from the bench as evidence of forgery and fraud serious enough to warrant it. "Mr. Holloway," she said, closing the file in front of her, "you spent 8 years building an elaborate structure on top of one forged signature, and it took a father's habit of keeping his paperwork honest, and a daughter willing to drop everything to defend him, to bring the entire thing down in a single morning. I would call that poetic, if it weren't so plainly criminal." The gavel came down. It was over. Grant Holloway was escorted from the courtroom by his own attorneys, not by security, though the 2 Meridian representatives who had arrived with him that morning left through a different exit entirely, already visibly distancing themselves from a man whose name would be in the news by that evening. Isaiah sat very still at the defendant's table for a long moment after the room began to empty, the way a person sits still when something they brace to lose has just been handed back to them whole. Amara sat down beside him, and for the first time since she'd walked through those courtroom doors, the fierce, controlled attorney fell away, and she was simply his daughter again, exhausted, relieved, blinking back tears she'd held through 7 sleepless nights and 40 minutes of cross-examination. "Dad," she said quietly, "it's over. It's really over." Isaiah turned to look at her, and the same words rose up in him that had risen up 15 years earlier in a freezing alley behind a woodworking shop, except this time they came out different, because so much had changed since the night he first said them. "You said you wouldn't be any trouble," he told her, his voice thick. 15 years ago. In that alley, you said you wouldn't be any trouble, and you'd try not to eat much." Amara laughed, wet and sudden, somewhere between a sob and real laughter. "And you told me to let you worry about that," she said. "I meant it then," Isaiah said, reaching for her hand across the table she'd argued his freedom back at. "I mean it 1,000 times more now. You have never once been trouble. Amara, you have been the best thing that ever walked into my life, and I am so proud of you I don't have the words for it." Michael was waiting outside the courthouse when they walked out, having driven straight from the job site the moment his shift ended, still in his work boots, and when he saw his father's face, not the tight, braced expression he'd worn walking in that morning, but something lighter, something that looked almost like the man Micah remembered from before all of this started. He didn't need anyone to tell him how the hearing had gone. He crossed the courthouse steps in 3 long strides and pulled his father into a hug that lasted longer than either of them meant it to, and then pulled Amara in beside him, the 3 of them standing together on the courthouse steps in thin autumn sunlight, exactly the way they'd stood together at 100 smaller moments over 15 years. Birthdays, graduations, ordinary Tuesday dinners, except this time with the specific relief of a family that had come within one signature of losing everything and hadn't. "I can't believe you drove all night," Micah said into his father's shoulder. "I can't believe either of you," Isaiah said, and his voice broke slightly on the last word, and neither of his children pretended not to notice, because in that family there had never been any shame in a man showing exactly how much he felt. The company reopened under its original name the following Monday. Reeves Manufacturing Company, Isaiah Reeves, founder and CEO, the way it had always been meant to read. Otis Fry was promoted to Chief Financial Officer, a title that finally matched the trust Isaiah had placed in him for years. Amara took an unpaid leave from her firm in Atlanta to help oversee the legal cleanup of Meridian's remaining claims, though everyone who watched her working those weeks in the small office behind the shop floor suspected, correctly, that this was not the last time she'd be involved in the company that had first given her a home. 6 months later, On a Saturday morning that smelled like sawdust and coffee, Isaiah stood in the same workshop where it had all begun, watching a new apprentice, a 17-year-old kid from a group home across town. Quiet, careful, watching everyone in the room the way someone watches a place they're not yet sure they're allowed to stay in. Measure a piece of walnut for the first time. Measure twice. Isaiah told him, cut once. And whatever else happens in this life, son, keep every receipt. Paper doesn't lie, even when people do. The boy nodded, the way Amara had nodded at that same lesson 17 years earlier, not fully understanding yet how much it would someday matter, only understanding that someone was taking the time to teach him something real. Across the shop floor, Amara sat with a fresh cup of coffee. Her law firm calls from Atlanta returned days ago, but her bag still, somehow, unpacked in the guest room. She watched her father teach a stranger's child the same lessons he'd once taught a frightened 9-year-old girl in an alley, and she understood, watching it, exactly why she'd driven through the night without a second thought, exactly why she would do it again 100 times over if she ever had to. Isaiah caught her eye across the room and smiled, the same steady, unshakable smile that had once made a terrified child believe, for the first time in her life, that she had finally found somewhere safe to land. Some debts, he had come to understand, were never meant to be repaid. They were only meant to be passed forward, one open door at a time, to whoever needed one next. And somewhere behind them, on the shop's back wall, hung a small hand-painted sign, the paint still slightly chipped at the corners, the same sign that had hung there since the very beginning. Reeves Fine Woodwork, a name Isaiah had never once changed through every version the company became, because it was the truest thing he'd ever built, and some things, he believed, were worth keeping visible no matter how far you travel from where you started.